The gavel came down like a death sentence. Sienna Rosenfeld stood at the back of the ancient chamber, her press badge clutched so tightly in her fist that the laminated edge bit into her palm, and watched as the vampire court of Noctist declared Alaric Radu a traitor to his bloodline. She had been in that underground hall for less than 6 minutes. She already knew they were lying. The chamber was carved from black marble, 300 feet beneath the financial district of Vienna, accessed through a private elevator disguised as a coat closet in the lobby of the Kaiserstein banking group. Sienna had found it the same way she found everything, by following money, asking the wrong people the right questions, and refusing to leave when asked politely. She had been told 3 times tonight that humans were not permitted in the Court of Blood. She had ignored all 3 warnings with the particular brand of cheerful stubbornness that had made her the most dangerous investigative journalist in Central Europe. Now she stood in shadows at the gallery's edge, watching a man she had spent 4 months investigating, a man she had started this investigation determined to expose as a criminal, stand in chains before a tribunal of ancient vampires who were absolutely, provably, and catastrophically wrong about everything they believed they knew about him. Alaric Radu stood in the center of the chamber floor with his wrists bound in silver-threaded manacles that glowed faint violet against his pale skin. He was exactly as she had imagined him, and nothing like it at the same time. She had seen photographs, blurry security footage, and one unfocused image taken through a telephoto lens from 400 meters away. None of it had captured the way he occupied space, the absolute stillness of him, the bone-white hair pulled back from a face so aristocratically carved, it looked like someone had spent centuries perfecting the angles. The crimson eyes that moved through the chamber, with the calm, measuring weight of someone who had seen empires rise and collapse, and was not particularly impressed by either. He was the heir to the Radu bloodline, the most powerful vampire dynasty in Central Europe. He was 28 when he was turned 417 years old by any calendar that could hold him, and he was currently being accused of selling the court's most protected secret, the location of the blood register, the ancient ledger that named every vampire living under mortal concealment, to a human extremist organization called the Order of the Stake. The chief arbiter, a skeletal ancient named Vesperin Kral, read the charges in a voice like grinding stone. Sienna's notebook was already half full. She had written the words that mattered in her private shorthand: planted evidence, timed frame, follow the money, follow Mira Solden. Because Mira Solden was the name that none of the arbiters had mentioned once in 45 minutes of proceedings, and Mira Solden was the woman Sienna had spent the last 11 days tracking through 3 countries, 2 shell corporations, and 1 very poorly encrypted email server. And Mira Solden was the one who had actually sold the blood register's location to the Order of the Stake. And Mira Solden was currently sitting in the front row of this chamber as the court's own senior counselor, watching Alaric Radu be condemned with a small, satisfied smile, pulling at the corner of her perfectly painted mouth. Sienna had 48 hours to prove it before the court's passed sentence. She did not know yet that proving it would require her to trust a vampire, or that trusting him would change every single thing she had ever believed about herself. She found out the first part about 6 seconds later, when a cold hand closed around her wrist from behind, and a voice like dark velvet said very quietly against her ear, "You should not be here, little detective. They will not care what press badge you carry when they decide what to do with you." She did not scream. She turned. Alaric Radu was standing behind her. She looked from him to the chains that were still very visibly attached to the figure in the center of the chamber, and then back at him and said, "You have a blood shadow projection," he said. "A useful trick when one knows a trap has been set. I have been watching this room from the gallery for 20 minutes. You arrived 6 minutes ago. You are either the bravest human I have encountered in 4 centuries, or the most reckless. Investigative journalists are generally both," Sienna said, and her voice was admirably steady, given that she was speaking to the most wanted vampire in Central Europe from a distance of approximately 40 centimeters in a pitch-dark alcove beneath 300 feet of solid stone. "I know you didn't do it. I have the evidence. I need you to not be sentenced to final death long enough for me to present it." The crimson eyes studied her with an intensity that she felt in her sternum. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds, which she counted. "Who are you?" he said. "Sienna Rosenfeld. I write for the Kaisersteinnift Investigative Review. I have been following the blood register leak for 4 months, and the trail leads directly to Meeressolden, not to you. I have documentation, wire transfers, and communication logs, and a witness who will testify to the court's arbiters if given immunity from blood law prosecution." Something shifted in his expression. The absolute, controlled stillness cracked open the smallest amount, like a seam of light appearing in a locked door, and what she saw through it was not the regal danger she expected, but something raw and private, the specific look of someone who had stopped believing that rescue was possible. "The arbiters will not listen to a human," he said. "They will if a human hands them a scandal they cannot ignore," she said. "Blood law may not let me testify, but it has no provision against me walking into that chamber right now and placing Meeressolden's financial records directly into Vesperin Kroll's hands. She transferred 400,000 euros to an order shell account 11 days ago. I have every routing number, I have the confirmation codes, I have a photograph of her meeting with the order's handler in Salzburg." The silence this time was different. Longer. The kind of silence that means someone is deciding something enormous. "If you walk into that chamber," he said, "they will detain you. Blood law permits the court to hold any human witness who enters proceedings without sanction for up to 3 days under the Hamel Secrecy clause. You would be at their mercy. Do you understand what you are volunteering for?" "I understand exactly what I am volunteering for," Sienna said. "I have spent 4 months on this. You are not guilty. The woman who framed you is sitting 30 meters from where we are standing, and she will watch them execute you tomorrow if I do not walk through that door." He looked at her for a long moment. In the dark of the alcove, with the sound of Vesperin Kroll's grinding voice continuing to list charges in the chamber below, the vampire heir of the Radu bloodline made a sound that was almost too quiet to be heard, and it took Sienna a moment to realize that it was a very controlled, very private version of the sound that means someone is overwhelmed. "Why?" he said. It was not a rhetorical question. It was the most direct, genuinely confused question she had ever been asked. "Because the truth matters," she said. "It always matters. Even down here." She moved toward the chamber door. His hand caught her wrist again, not restraining her this time, just present. Warm, she noticed, despite the pale skin. Vampires ran warmer than the stories said when they were fully vital. She had read that once in a forensic pathology report she was not supposed to have access to. "Not yet," he said. "If you walk in there with documents alone, Solden will move to have them dismissed under the contamination doctrine. Evidence gathered by a human outside of sanctioned inquiry can be rejected by the court's arbiters without review. We need a vampire sponsor. Someone of standing who can formally introduce your findings." "Do you have someone?" she said. "I have one," he said. "My father's eldest ally, Lord Cassivian Muir. He is in Vienna tonight. He does not know I am here, because I could not contact anyone inside the court without risking Solden's network intercepting the message." He paused. "If you can get a message to Cassivian Muir in the next 40 minutes, before the arbiters call for the sentence vote, we may have a chance." "Give me his address," she said. "It is not an address," he said. "It is a location. He will be at the 11 Swords Hotel, 4th floor, in the room registered under the name Velthar. He does not answer doors for humans." "He will answer for me," Sienna said, with a certainty she was mostly feeling rather than logically supporting. "I am very persistent." And then she looked at him directly and said, "Can you stay hidden for 40 minutes? "I have stayed hidden for 3 days, he said. 40 minutes is a courtesy. Then stay hidden, she said, and trust me." He said nothing, but he let go of her wrist very slowly, and when she pulled away and moved toward the service corridor that would take her back to the elevator, she felt his gaze on her back like a hand placed gently between her shoulder blades. Steady, there, and more protective than it had any logical right to be from someone she had known for 9 minutes. The 11 Swords Hotel was 4 blocks from the Kaiserstein banking group, a narrow building with no signage beyond a small brass plaque, the kind of place that did not appear on tourist maps and kept its guests from appearing on any map at all. Sienna walked in through the front door, told the front desk her name, and that she had urgent information for the guest in 417 regarding events currently taking place in the Court of Blood, and watched the young woman behind the desk go very still and reach for a telephone that did not connect to any external line. 8 minutes later, she was sitting across from Lord Cassivian Murray in a suite that smelled of old leather and cedar and something metallic that she was choosing not to examine too closely. Cassivian Muir was ancient in the way that only the oldest vampires were ancient, the kind of age that had become elegant, all silver-white hair and a face of terrifying stillness, dressed in a charcoal suit that was almost but not entirely modern. Wearing cufflinks that she would have bet her career were from the 17th century. He had read every document she laid on the table in front of him without touching them, using his eyes alone with the specific efficiency of someone accustomed to processing information very fast. When he finished, he was quiet for 31 seconds. She counted those too. Mira Solden has been the court's senior counselor for 60 years, he said. She has never shown inclination toward betrayal. She showed inclination toward money, Sienna said, 400,000 euros worth. The order approached her 2 years ago, and she has been feeding them information in increments ever since, small enough that no single item would trigger an alert. The blood register location was the final delivery, the largest payment, and she built Alaric Radu's frame from archived court communications she had access to as senior counselor. She was the only person outside the Radu bloodline with access to his private court correspondences, which is what she used to fabricate the leak evidence. Cassivian Muir's pale fingers moved to the edge of the table. If this is accurate, he said, and if the court convicts Alaric on fabricated evidence, then Mira Solden will have done more damage to the Radu bloodline than any enemy in its 400-year history. Yes, Sienna said, and she will still be sitting in the front row of that chamber with a smile on her face while it happens, unless you go in there right now and introduce these findings under your sponsor's authority. He looked at her for a long moment, not with suspicion exactly, with something more like the ticular assessment of a very old, very careful being deciding whether the human in front of him was worth the risk she represented. Why did Alaric trust you? He said. He did not at first, she said. I think he trusted the evidence. The truth is very hard to argue with when someone puts it directly in front of you. He sent you to me, Cassivian Murray said. He could have run. He has been in hiding for 3 days. He could have continued to run. Instead, he sent a human woman to my door with documentation. A pause. He must have believed very strongly in both your capabilities and your honesty. Sienna said nothing. She was thinking about the way his hand had felt around her wrist, the warmth of it. I will go, Cassivian Muir said. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at her with ancient eyes that held something that might have been approval. You will come with me. You will stand at the chamber's threshold, which is permitted under the observer clause for human witnesses introduced by a vampire sponsor. You will not speak unless Vesperin Kroll addresses you directly. Understood, Sienna said. And, Miss Rosenfeld, he said. You should be aware that by formally entering this proceeding, you become subject to the Heir secrecy clause. You will not be able to publish what you learn tonight. She had expected this. She had already decided. Then I will publish what I already have, she said. The financial records, the wire transfers, the Salzburg photograph. Those were gathered before I entered any proceedings. The court cannot suppress independently gathered evidence under the secrecy clause. The clause only applies to information disclosed within the chamber itself. Cassivian Muir was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, he was right about you. They returned to the Kaiserstein Banking Group's hidden elevator with 22 minutes to spare before the arbiters would call for the vote. The chamber exploded, not literally, but in the way that only a very old, very formalized court can explode, through the sudden, rigid, barely contained shock of an entire body of ancient beings confronted with information that dismantled everything they believed was true. Cassivian Muir walked through the chamber doors with the authority of someone who had been old when most of the court's current members were turned, placed Sienna's documents on the arbiter's table with a formal introduction that invoked 3 separate ancient sponsor rights that Vesperin Kroll could not override, and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the marble hall, the charge against Alaric Radu is false. The evidence against him is fabricated, and the architect of both the fabrication and the true betrayal of the blood register is currently sitting among you." Every eye in the chamber went to Mira Solden. Mira Solden, to her credit, did not break immediately. She sat very still for a long moment, with the specific stillness of someone running through options very rapidly and finding each one closed. Then she looked at the documents on the arbiter's table. Then she looked at Sienna, standing at the chamber threshold, and her expression did something complicated and cold. A human's documents carry no weight under the contamination doctrine, Mira Solden said, and her voice was perfectly even. "Whatever this girl has gathered is inadmissible." The financial records were independently gathered before any court proceeding began, Cassivian Muri said. "They fall outside the contamination doctrine's scope, and I am formally sponsoring this witness's testimony, which brings her findings under my bloodline's authority of vouching. You will need to address the contamination doctrine challenge to me directly, Count Sala." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something built on lies discovering that its foundation is gone. Vesperin Crawl picked up the documents. He read them with the same unreadable expression he had used throughout the proceedings, which was extremely difficult to interpret, and therefore extremely stressful for everyone watching. The chamber was so quiet that Sienna could hear the blood moving in her own ears. Then Vesperin Crawl looked up from the documents and looked at Mira Solden and said, "The tribunal will recess. Councillor Solden will be detained pending a full forensic review of her communications and financial records under blood law sanction." The blood shadow projection in the center of the chamber dissolved. Mira Solden stood very quickly, which was a mistake, because moving quickly in a chamber full of ancient vampires when you have just been ordered detained is the kind of decision that ends poorly and ended poorly very quickly. 3. Court guards were at her sides in less than a second, and the silver-threaded manacles that had been around Alaric Radu's projected wrists were now around hers, and the small, satisfied smile was gone from the corner of her mouth entirely. Sienna let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 45 minutes. The real Alaric Radu walked through the chamber's side door 3 minutes later. She saw him before anyone else did, not because she was watching the door, but because she had become without quite deciding, to the sort of person who was aware of exactly where he was in any given space. He looked different entering the chamber on his own terms rather than bound in its center. Taller, somehow. The white hair was loose now, falling past his jaw, and he moved through the crowd of court members with the absolute ease of someone who had never in 4 centuries expected anything from the world but that it get out of his way. He walked to the arbiter's table. He said, in a quiet, completely controlled voice, "I am returning myself to the court's custody so that the forensic review may proceed. I have nothing to hide, and I expect the full truth to be established before sunrise." Vesperin Crawl looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were very old and not entirely readable, and then said, "Your return is noted, Lord Radu. The tribunal will convene in full at midnight." Then Alaric Radu turned, and he found Sienna across the chamber with an immediacy that made it clear he had already known exactly where she was standing, and he walked toward her, and the crowd of ancient vampires parted around him without him doing anything at all, which told her everything she needed to know about the kind of presence he carried in a room. He stopped in front of her, very close. The crimson eyes were doing the thing she was beginning to recognize, the thing where they moved across her face the way someone reads something important, carefully and completely. "You did it," he said. "I told you I would," she said. "You went to Cassivian Muir's door in the middle of the night and convinced a 700-year-old lord to walk into a court proceeding based on 11 days of independent investigation." 9 days, she said. The last 2 days were mostly documentation review. Something happened in his expression that she could not fully categorize. It was not the controlled blankness of before. It was warmer than that, more unguarded. The specific look of someone who has been alone in something difficult for a very long time and has just, without expecting it, not been alone anymore. "You could have published everything you had," he said. "The wire transfers. The Salzburg photograph. You had enough to expose Solden in the human press without ever coming here tonight. You would have been safe. The story would have run. you would have received the credit. The court would have suppressed any human press coverage under the Heimel secrecy clauses before it could affect the proceedings, she said. The timeline would not have worked. The vote would have happened before the publication could circulate widely enough to matter. The only way to stop the sentence was to bring the evidence directly into this chamber. You knew that, he said. I had calculated it, she said. Yes. You walked into a vampire court, he said, very quietly, to save someone you had never met. I walked into a vampire court, she corrected, to make sure the truth was the thing that won. You happened to be the person the truth was in favor of. The corners of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was more controlled than that, more private. But it was the closest thing to one she had seen from him, and it changed his face in a way that made her chest do something she was choosing not to examine right now. Sienna Rosenfeld, he said, and the way he said her name was different from how he had said it before in the dark of the alcove. Less formal, more something. Alaric Radu, she said back with a steadiness she was very proud of. I owe you a debt that Bloodlaw would consider unpayable, he said. You do not owe me anything, she said. The truth is not something you can go into debt for. It is just what was right. He looked at her for a moment that stretched in a way that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was very full. Then Cassivian Muir appeared at Alaric's shoulder, spoke several words in a language too old for Sienna to identify, and Alaric straightened and the controlled blankness came back over his face, and the moment became the particular kind of not a moment that you carry with you anyway. The midnight tribunal lasted 4 hours. Sienna sat in the gallery through all of it under the formal protection of Cassivian Muir's sponsor, Right, which meant that no one in the chamber could approach or address her without his sanction. She watched the forensic review unfold in real time, court analysts pulling Mira Solden's communication records under Bloodlaw warrant, cross-referencing them with the documentation Sienna had brought, building a map of 2 years of systematic betrayal with the kind of meticulous, unhurried precision that only beings with unlimited time could sustain. Myra Solden confessed at 3:47 in the morning. Not because the evidence was not enough. It was more than enough, she confessed, Sienna thought. Because 4 hours of watching it, assembled piece by piece, in front of an entire room of people who had trusted her for 60 years, finally became heavier than whatever she had been carrying in silence. She said she had done it because the order of the stake had threatened the life of someone she loved, a human, a man who had been her companion for 30 years in secret, and the order had found him and used him as leverage until she had no choice she could find. She said she knew there was no defense under Bloodlaw for what she had done. She said she was sorry for what she had done to Alaric, and that the sorry was real even if nothing else could be. Sienna wrote none of this down. She was bound by the Heimel secrecy clause. But she sat with it, because it was a human story underneath the vampire politics. A woman who loved someone and was used against herself because of it. And those stories mattered even in forms you could not publish. The tribunal formally cleared Alaric Radu of all charges at 4:22 in the morning. The announcement was delivered by Vesperin Crawl in the same grinding stone voice that had read the charges against him 6 hours earlier, and every word of it was witnessed by the entire assembled court. Alaric stood in the center of the chamber without chains this time, and received it with exactly the same stillness he had brought to every moment of the night. When it was finished, Vesperin Crawl did something that Sienna suspected was extremely rare for him. He looked at Sienna directly, from across the chamber, and inclined his head. It was the smallest of gestures. It meant something significant. She inclined hers back, and was careful not to let the relief she felt show on her face until after he had looked away. The court cleared quickly after that. Old vampires did not linger the way human crowds did. When business was concluded, they dispersed with the efficiency of beings who had learned centuries ago not to waste time on the social aftermath of difficult events. Alaric found her in the gallery as she was gathering her notebooks. The court has forcefully requested that I thank you, he said. That is very formal, she said. I am also personally thanking you, he said, with just enough of a distinction in his tone to make it clear the difference was intentional. Also accepted, she said. She snapped her notebook closed, looked up at him. In the low light of the gallery, with the chamber mostly empty now, he was. She was allowing herself to think this directly for the first time, extraordinarily beautiful in a way that was not quite human, and therefore not quite anything she had an existing emotional category for. The white hair, the crimson eyes, the planes of that face, the way he was still warmer than she expected. The way he stood always like the room was something he had decided to permit. "What happens to Mira Solden?" she said. "Blood law has provisions for counsellors who betray the register," he said. "Her sentence will be set by the full court. It will be serious, but it will account for the coercion she suffered. The man the order used against her, the court will find him and bring him somewhere safe. That is also blood law's obligation, to acknowledge when someone is weaponized into betrayal." "That surprises me," Sienna said honestly. "I did not expect the vampire court to concern itself with human victims." "We are very old," he said, "but we are not without understanding of what it means to love someone and be used against yourself because of it." A pause. "Some of us understand it very well." She looked at him carefully. "What happens to the order of the stake?" she said. "They still have whatever partial information Solden managed to pass before the register's location reached them. The court will move to verify and reclassify every compromised record," he said. "It will take months. The order's handler in Salzburg will be located. That is not your problem to solve, Miss Rosenfeld." "Sienna," she said. "A beat, Sienna," he said, and there it was again, that specific quality in how her name sounded when he said it, like he was being careful with it. She picked up her bag. She should leave. The sun would be up in 2 hours, and she needed to file at least a partial version of the night's events, using only information that predated her entering the court proceedings, the financial records, the Salzburg photograph, the Shell Corporation documentation, the wire transfers. Enough to tell the public that Mira Solden had been the blood register leak without revealing anything she was bound not to reveal. She had also, she realized, not slept in 21 hours. "Can I get you out?" she said, because the elevator was the only way up and she was not entirely sure of the protocol for who left first in a vampire court. "I know the way," he said, "but I will walk with you." They went up in the elevator together, in a silence that was the comfortable kind. The kind that happens after something enormous has been shared, when the talking has been sufficient, and presence is its own language. Sienna watched the floor counter tick upward and thought about 4 months of investigation that had started as a story about a powerful figure she expected to be guilty and ended with her standing 40 centimeters from that figure in an elevator beneath Vienna. Finding that the proximity felt entirely natural, which was a fact she was going to need to sit with for a while, the elevator opened into the coat closet. They walked through the banking lobby, which was empty at 5 in the morning, and out onto the pavement, where Vienna, in the earliest dark before dawn, was cool and clean, and smelled of old stone and the river. Alaric stopped outside the door. He looked up at the sky, which was still fully dark, with the particular awareness she had noticed in him that was never quite anxiety, but was always precise. He had 90 minutes before the sun made the open street dangerous. "Where are you staying?" he said. "The Goldener Hirsch," she said. 15 minutes from here." "I know it," he said. She looked at him. "Are you offering to walk me?" she said. "You just saved my life," he said, with the careful gravity that she was learning was his particular version of warmth. "Walking you 15 minutes to your hotel is the least inadequate thing I can do before sunrise. I am a 29-year-old detective journalist who has navigated 4 countries in 11 days, she said. "I can walk 15 minutes in Vienna." "I know," he said. "I am not walking you because you cannot walk yourself. I am walking you because I want to." The distinction sat between them for a moment, warm and direct. "All right," she said. They walked. The city was theirs at that hour, the old streets and the lit windows and the occasional night shift worker moving at a distance. Sienna matched his pace, which was long and unhurried, and found that it matched hers in a way that felt easy. She asked him about the blood shadow projection, because she was constitutionally incapable of letting an interesting technical detail go unexplored. He explained it with the patience of someone who enjoyed being asked genuine questions rather than fearful ones, his voice in the quiet street creating a low sound that she was aware of in a way that was purely physical and that she was also going to need to sit with. She learned in 15 minutes that he disliked blood politics but understood their necessity. that he had spent 200 of his 417 years largely alone, by choice, finding the court's social mechanics exhausting and its power games expensive. That he had returned to Vienna specifically because his father had died 6 months ago, and he had felt an obligation to the bloodline that was stronger than his preference for solitude. That the betrayal, being named traitor by a court he had returned to out of loyalty, had been specific in its cruelty for exactly that reason. She did not say this out loud, but she thought, of course he had been targeted when he was vulnerable. That is how predators work. She had seen it in human courts, human boardrooms, human families. The loneliest member is the easiest one to frame. When the charges were first read, she said, as they came within sight of the Goldener Hirsch, in those first hours before you established the blood shadow projection, were you afraid? He was quiet for 2 steps. I was angry, he said. Anger is more useful than fear. I was also, he paused. There is a particular kind of grief when a community you return to out of love condemns you. It is different from being condemned by enemies. I knew the charges were false. What I did not know was whether the truth would matter, whether anyone would look for it. A pause. I had concluded by the time you arrived that no one would. Someone was always going to look for it, Sienna said. The trail was real, it existed. Trails do not stop existing just because no one is following them yet. But you had to be the one following it, he said. Not someone else. You! She stopped in front of the hotel's door. He stopped with her. Are you saying I was unlikely? She said. I am saying, he said carefully, that I am very glad you were the specific person following that trail, and not only because of the outcome. The street was empty. The sky was still dark. They were standing in the particular geography of the exact moment before something changes. She could feel the edge of it, the way you feel an approaching threshold. What will you do now? She said. The court will need you for the aftermath. The reclassification of the register records. Yes, he said. I will be in Vienna for some time. I will also be in Vienna, she said. Filing, following up. I know, he said. I would like to see you while you are here. For officially court-sanctioned debriefs, she said. No, he said, not for that. She looked at him in the warm light of the hotel's entrance, this ancient, regal, dangerous, deeply honorable vampire who had stood in silver chains and not broken, who had stayed hidden rather than run, who had trusted a stranger with the only path back to the truth, who was now standing on a Vienna pavement at 5 in the morning, asking to see her in terms that were very plain. And she did not need to be a detective to read them. Yes, she said, I would like that. The expression that crossed his face then was brief and entirely unguarded. The kind of look that does not survive more than a second in someone so controlled, but that tells you everything you need to know in the second it lasts. Then the controlled stillness came back, and he said, Good night, Sienna Rosenfeld, in a voice that was quietly, unmistakably warm. Good night, Alaric Radu, she said. She went inside. She stood in the lobby for a moment with her bag on her shoulder and her notebooks full of shorthand and her pulse doing something entirely non-professional, and thought that she had started this investigation 4 months ago trying to expose a criminal, and had instead found something she did not have a category for yet but was going to figure out. She was very good at figuring things out. The aftermath took 3 weeks. The Order of the Stakes handler in Salzburg, a human man named Brennus Claff, who had been running anti-vampire operations under charitable organization cover for 11 years, was located by the court on the 4th day. Through methods Sienna was not privy to and chose not to investigate, because she was a journalist and not a vampire operative, and there were categories of truth she was comfortable not pursuing. The Order's partially compromised information on the blood register was rendered obsolete when the court moved every flagged record to new classifications within a week, a logistical undertaking that Alaric described to her over dinner on the 6th night as approximately the vampire equivalent of changing every lock in a very large castle while also continuing to operate the castle. She saw him every day of those 3 weeks. Not always for long. The court had legitimate demands on his time, and she had legitimate demands on her own, but daily. Coffee in the morning sometimes, in a small place near the Kaiserstein building, where the owner knew him and brought his order without being asked. Walks in the evening, when the late autumn sun was down early enough to make the streets available to him by 5. Dinner. Several times, in a private room he had access to at a very old restaurant that also did not appear on any tourist map, they talked about everything. She had never in her adult life found someone so willing to engage with every idea she brought to a conversation, not politely but genuinely, pushing back when he disagreed, extending when he found something interesting, asking questions that revealed how carefully he had listened. She had also never in her adult life found someone who looked at her the way he did, with that particular quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was not general to his personality but specific to her. On the 9th day, she asked him about what it was like to be turned. He answered honestly. He had been 28 in the year 1603, the son of a Wallachian nobleman, turned by the court's then patriarch during a political alliance that was less of an invitation and more of a requirement. He had not chosen it. He had spent the first decades of his immortality in the specific grief of someone who loved the life they had and had not been given the chance to keep it. Then, over time, the grief became something different. Not acceptance, exactly, but a different relationship with permanence. He had loved people in those 4 centuries and lost them to time, which he described in a way that was so matter-of-fact and so quietly devastating that Sienna set her glass down and looked at him directly. "Does it become easier?" she said. "Losing people to time? No," he said. "You learn to hold them differently. The love does not become smaller, the loss does not become less. But you learn that love is worth the loss, that the alternative, not loving in order to avoid losing, is its own form of death." A pause. "I spent approximately 200 years choosing the alternative. It did not serve Monsieur." She understood what he was saying that was not quite being said directly. She was 31 years old, and he was 417. And those numbers were not nothing. She was going to think about them, had been thinking about them, could not pretend the thought did not exist. "I am not asking for anything," he said, reading her silence with the precision she was beginning to expect from him. I do not operate with expectation where you are concerned. You came into my life from a direction I could not have predicted, doing something I could not have hoped for, and whatever form that takes, whatever you need it to be, I will accept." "What do you want it to be?" she said directly. He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant's private room was warm and dimly lit, and the sound of the street outside was muffled and distant, and the world was very small in exactly the right way. "I want to know you," he said, "all of you. Not the journalist and not the woman who saved my life, though I love both of those things. The version underneath, the one that counts things when she is nervous. The one that reaches for her notebook when she is processing something she cannot say yet. The one that walks into underground vampire courts in the middle of the night because she cannot tolerate injustice, even when it is not her injustice to fix." Sienna felt warmth move through her chest that was not the wine. "You noticed the counting," she said. "I noticed everything about you," he said simply. "From the moment you turned around in that alcove and told me you knew I was innocent before you had even spoken to me, I have been paying very close attention ever since." She looked at him across the table. This ancient and regal and quietly ardent being who had survived 4 centuries of loss and politics and betrayal and was sitting in a warm restaurant in Vienna, looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in 400 years, and she thought, "I have been paying close attention too, and what I see is someone I would choose, in any world, under any circumstances, regardless of every category in which we are impossible." "Then I would like you to keep paying attention," she said. "And I would like to keep paying attention to you, and we can see where that goes." The smile that came to his face then was slower than his previous ones, and fuller, and it was so genuinely happy that it made her breath catch in a way she was not going to apologize for. "I am 417 years old," he said. "I have infinite patience." "You will need it," she said, honestly. "I am very complicated." "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I like most." 3 days after that dinner, the situation with the order of the stake became suddenly and significantly less settled. The partial information that the order had received before the court's reclassification contained not the full blood register, but a subset. A list of 17 vampires living under deep mortal concealment in 3 European cities, including Vienna. The court had moved to protect those 17 individuals immediately, relocating most of them within the first week. 3 had not been reachable. On the 12th day, one of those 3 was found. Her name was Sienna Radu. She was Alaric's cousin, not blood relation to Sienna, but deeply connected to Alaric, and she had been living as a concert pianist in Vienna's 2nd district under a mortal identity for 40 years. The order located her through her pattern of evening performances, which her identity change had not fully disrupted, and on the 12th evening 2 order operatives followed her from a concert hall. The court knew within an hour. Alaric knew within the same hour, through a court alert system that reached him on his phone. Because even ancient vampire nobility used encrypted court communication apps in the 21st century. And he was out of the restaurant where he and Sienna were sitting before she had fully processed what he had said. She followed him. She should not have. He told her very clearly outside the restaurant door, with his hand on her arm and his eyes at a level of acute intensity that she had not seen from him before, that this was a court matter, and she was not to be involved, and he needed her to go back to her hotel, and he would call her when it was resolved. She told him that she was a faster researcher than any court operative, and that if 2 order members had followed Elizabeth, they had done so using communication equipment that she could trace if he gave her their last known location, because she had spent 4 months developing methods for tracking order communications, and she was probably the foremost human expert on the order's operational patterns in existence. He stared at her for 1 second. "You are going to be the death of me," he said, but the way he said it was complicated, and the hand on her arm tightened briefly in a way that was protective and present rather than restraining. "The address," she said. He gave her the address. She had her laptop open in a cafe 3 blocks from the concert hall within 8 minutes, and Alaric was somewhere in the night doing things she was choosing not to think about in too much detail, and the communication logs she had already archived from the order's encrypted network, improperly secured, as she had discovered in week 2 of her original investigation, told her, within 19 minutes, that the 2 operatives had a 3rd contact waiting at an address in the 14th district, and that Elizabeth was being moved toward that address at that moment. She texted Alaric the address. The response came back in 4 seconds, which was no words at all, just a single confirmation mark, and she sat in the cafe and held her phone and told herself very firmly that he was 417 years old and had been navigating dangerous situations for 4 centuries, and that Elizabeth would be fine and he would be fine, and she was not afraid, she was just. Paying close attention, Alaric arrived at the 14th district address before the order operatives did. She learned this afterward from him, sitting in the lobby of the Goldener Hirsch at 2 in the morning, where he found her because she had told him where she would be, and she had been there, waiting, for an hour and 40 minutes. Elizabeth was safe. The 2 operatives and their contact were in court custody. No one had been significantly harmed. The order's Vienna cell was now exposed, which gave the court enough to dismantle its remaining infrastructure within the week. He sat across from her in the lobby's small seating area, and he said, "You waited. Of course I waited," she said. "You could have gone to bed," he said. "I know," she said. "I did not want to go to bed. I wanted to know you were all right." Something moved across his face that she had no name for, something very old and very private and entirely unguarded. "I am all right," he said. "I see that," she said. She reached across the small table and put her hand over his, and his fingers turned under hers and held, and they sat in the lobby of the Goldener Hirsch at 2 in the morning in perfect quiet, and it was the most natural thing she had ever done. "Are you frightened of what I am?" he said very quietly. "No," she said. "Are you frightened of what I am?" "You mean mortal," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet. Then, "I told you I spent 200 years not loving, in order to avoid losing. I told you it did not serve me. I meant it. Whatever the cost of loving someone mortal, whatever the eventual grief of it, I would rather have the love. I have had the alternative. It is hollow in a way that 4 centuries of living cannot fill." "Good," she said, and she meant it as an answer to everything, to his fear and his honesty and his choice, and the warm weight of his hand under hers. The following week, Elizabeth invited Sienna to dinner. This was, Alaric explained, not a small thing. Elizabeth Radu had spent 40 years guarding her concealed life with the particular vigilance of a vampire in deep mortal cover, and she invited almost no one into her private spaces. The invitation meant she had decided Sienna mattered. Isaveth was nothing like Alaric physically, where he was still and controlled and measured. She was animated and ironic, and laughed with a frequency and a fullness that seemed improbable, given that she was 300 years old. She had a grand piano in her apartment's main room and spent the first 20 minutes of dinner making Sienna and sit and listen to her play, not as performance but as a form of introduction. She always does this, Alaric said quietly, from the chair beside Sienna. It is how she decides whether she likes someone. She watches how they listen. How am I doing? Sienna said. Very well, he said. And he was watching Isaveth, but she could hear the warmth in his voice from where she was sitting. Isaveth made a dinner that was entirely for Sienna's benefit. She did not eat human food herself, but she had clearly researched the menu with considerable care. And over that dinner, she told Sienna everything the court records would not say about Alaric. How he had spent most of the 17th century translating ancient manuscripts because it gave him a relationship with human intellectual history that he found sustaining. How he had once, in the 19th century, spent 11 years corresponding with a mortal scientist about the nature of memory without ever revealing what he was. How he had fought for 3 decades within the court to establish the blood law protections that prevented vampire nobles from using mortals in their political disputes. A law, Sienna noted with a complicated feeling, that had ultimately not protected Mira Solden's companion, though it had ensured the court acknowledged his situation. He has always believed in protection, Isaveth said, looking at Sienna with eyes that were ancient and very kind. Not in the sense of controlling things, in the sense of refusing to let harm reach the people he cares for. It is the most consistent thing about him across 400 years, and he is extraordinarily bad at letting anyone do anything for him in return. I have noticed, Sienna said. You did it anyway, Isaveth said. You walked into the court and gave him back his name. He will not tell you what that meant to him because he will find the words inadequate. But I can tell you that in 400 years I have not seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Alaric, across the table, said. What? She said, without any particular concern. It is true. She should know it. He looked at the table for a moment with an expression that was the most authentically embarrassed she had ever seen on him, which was deeply endearing, and then looked at Sienna with the crimson eyes that had been finding her in every room for 3 weeks, and said, It is true, I know, Sienna said gently, and you should know the same. Isaveth made a sound of satisfaction and refilled Sienna's wineglass with the air of someone whose work here was done. The formal court proceedings concluded on the 20th day. Mira Solden received a sentence that the tribunal called diminishment, the stripping of her court standing and memory clearance of all classified knowledge she had held, followed by a minimum of 100 years of monitored exile from court politics. Solden had not contested the sentence. She received it with the stillness of someone who had run out of defenses, and had also, somewhere in the process, found a version of relief in that, the man the order had used against her. His name was Daniel, a retired teacher from Graz, who had spent 30 years as Mira Solden's companion, without fully understanding what she was, and who had spent 3 months terrified in order custody before the court located him, was returned to his family in good health. The court provided him with the standard resources extended to mortals who had been involved in vampire political situations, financial support, counseling from a court-sanctioned mortal liaison, and a formal apology that Vesperin Kroll delivered personally in Graz, which Sienna suspected was also extremely rare for Vesperin Kroll. Alaric told her about the Daniel outcome on a walk along the Danube Canal on the 21st evening, when the cold had come properly into Vienna, and the lights of the city were reflected in the water, and the night was very clear. The court's treatment of mortals in these situations is improving, he said. Not fast enough, but improving. Because of the protections you pushed for, she said. Because people keep pushing, he said. That is the only reason anything improves. Continuous pressure in the direction of what is right. She thought about Mira Solden and Daniel, and 30 years of a relationship conducted in the gap between 2 worlds, and the harm that had come from that gap. and she thought, "That is not going to be us. We are not going to let the gap be what defines this." She said, "I need to ask you something." "Yes," he said. "The blood law provisions around mortal-vampire relationships," she said, "for ordinary members of the court community, not nobles, but ordinary members. What are the current provisions? What rights do mortals in those relationships have?" He looked at her. His expression was very careful and very warm. "Currently," he said, "a mortal who is formally acknowledged by a vampire of standing has access to court protection under the Hamel Aegis Clause. They cannot be used in political disputes. They are entitled to court-sanctioned medical support. And if the relationship is formally registered, they are entitled to information about the vampire world relevant to their safety." A pause. "The provisions are imperfect. They are also significantly better than they were 100 years ago." "Could you register a relationship?" she said. "With me, eventually, if that is what this becomes." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. The canal was dark and bright at once beside them, and the city moved at a distance, and they were standing very close together in the cold night air, and his face in the light of the canal was doing the thing where everything usually controlled went entirely soft and open. "Yes," he said. I would." "Sienna, not tonight," she said. "I am not asking for tonight. I am asking whether it is possible, whether you would want it. Those are different questions from asking for it now." "I would want it," he said with quiet absoluteness. "I would want to give you every protection available to me. I would want." He stopped, started again. "I have told you I spent 200 years not loving in order to avoid loss. I will not do that again. I want to love you. I want it to be real and acknowledged and protected by everything I have access to. I want you to be able to move through the world I inhabit without being at risk because no one has formally named you as someone I protect." He paused. "That may be more than you were asking." "No," she said. "It is exactly what I was asking. I just wanted to hear you say it." She looked up at him. The cold air, the lights on the water, the city around them, and this being who had been alive for 4 centuries and was choosing, carefully and clearly, and with every protection he could provide, to love her. She went up on her toes and kissed him, which was something she had been thinking about since approximately the 3rd day of knowing him, and which was exactly as it should be. Warm, unhurried, certain, and briefly the only thing in the world. He kissed her back with the care of someone who understood that the things you love most deserve the most attention. When they pulled apart, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I have been thinking about doing that since you turned around in that alcove and told me you already knew I was innocent." "I know," she said, and she was smiling. "You are very good at paying attention, but you have been looking at me for 3 weeks in a way that is quite readable if you know how to read faces." "And you know how to read faces," he said. "I am a detective," she said. "It is quite literally the job." He laughed. A real one. Full and unhurried, the kind that came from somewhere deeply private. And she decided then that making him laugh like that was something she was going to spend a very significant portion of her future pursuing. The last week in Vienna settled like something that had always been going to happen. Sienna published her account of the blood register case, the parts she was permitted to publish, which were sufficient. The financial records, the Salzburg photograph, the Shell Corporation trail, the public-facing elements of the Order of the Stakes Vienna cell exposure. She wrote it carefully, without naming any vampire directly, without revealing anything protected under the Hamel secrecy clause, and it ran across 4 publications, including 2 major European newspapers. The response was significant. The Order of the Stakes charitable cover in 3 countries was pulled within a week. She received an award nomination 6 weeks later that she accepted in absentia because she was in Vienna and not ready to be anywhere else yet, Alaric told her. When she mentioned the nomination with the casual deflection she generally used for professional recognition, that she should accept it completely and without deflection because it was earned and she had done something important, and she was not allowed to minimize it in his presence. She told him he was very bossy. He said, "I have been told this before. It has not become less true." She laughed, which was the response he had been waiting for. The night before she was scheduled to take the train to Berlin for a follow-up story. They sat in the small apartment he had taken in Vienna's first district for the duration of the court aftermath, with the large windows looking out over rooftops and the room lit by several dozen candles because he genuinely preferred them, and she had decided this was a preference she would adopt without argument, and she looked at him across the low table and thought, "I did not know I was looking for this, but it is exactly this." "I will be back in 3 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "You could come to Berlin," she said. "I could," he said. "The court will not need me every day. Cassivian Mure is more than capable of managing the aftermath without me present." "Then come to Berlin," she said. "For part of it," he said. "Not all of it. You have a life that belongs to you, and I will not crowd it." "You have never crowded anything," she said. "You are very good at being present without being overwhelming. It is honestly an unusual quality." "I have had 400 years to practice," he said. "Come for the second week," she said. "I will have the initial legwork done by then, and we can spend the week being something other than professionally occupied." "What would we do?" he said, with a quality of attention that she had learned meant he was genuinely curious, and also very slight, quietly, controlledly, hoping. "I want to show you things," she said. "I want to take you somewhere and say, look at this, I love this, and watch what you think of it. I want to see what you look like in a city I know, and you do not. I want to find a restaurant that you will like without already knowing the answer." He was very quiet for a moment. The candlelight moved across his face. "Yes," he said. "I would like all of that very much." "Good," she said. "Bring your warmest coat. Berlin in November is not for giving." "I have lived through ice ages," he said completely seriously. "The one genuine advantage of being 400 years old," she said. "One of several," he said, and he was smiling. She went to Berlin. He came at the end of the first week, not the second, because he finished what the court needed from him 3 days early, and called her to ask whether the invitation still stood. And she said obviously it still stood, and he was there by midnight. She met him at the station, which she had debated doing and then decided was simply what you did when someone came to your city and you wanted to see them. He came off the platform with the white hair and the pale skin and the crimson eyes and the particular way he moved through a crowd, which was not aggressive, just absolute, the way a river moves, everything finding its way around him. And when he saw her, he stopped for a moment, just a moment, with an expression of complete and private happiness. She walked toward him. He met her halfway. She showed him Berlin. She showed him the places she had worked in for years, the canal-side cafe where she wrote best, the bookshop with the deep basement where the old maps were kept, the crossing where the city divided itself and then refused to stay divided. She showed him these things and watched what he did with them, which was to look at everything with the specific, careful quality of someone who had learned to look at the world as though each thing is singular. And he talked about what he saw in a way that made her see it differently too, which was one of the best things anyone had ever done for her. On the 4th night in Berlin, they stood on a bridge over the Spree, with the cold coming off the water and the city lit in every direction, and he stood behind her with his arms around her and his chin resting very lightly against her temple, and she leaned back into the warmth of him and thought, 4 months ago I was trying to prove that you were guilty of something, and now here we are on a bridge in Bern being completely and rather embarrassingly in love. What are you thinking? He said. He always asked. He was genuinely interested in the answer every time. That this is a very unexpected outcome of a very difficult investigation, she said. For both of us, he said. Are you glad, she said. Of everything, he said. The court proceedings, the 3 days in hiding, the charges? Of all of it, of where it ended. He was quiet for a moment, his arm steady around her, his voice near her ear. I would have chosen this outcome 100 times, he said, including the hiding and the charges and the fear if this is where it leads. Yes, I am very glad. She turned in his arms and looked at his face at the crimson eyes in the Berlin night and said, Good, because I am keeping you. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely soft and entirely his, the version of him that was not the court heir or the ancient noble or the dangerous vampire lord, but simply and specifically Alaric, 417 years old and completely undone by a 31-year-old human detective who had walked into his trial on a Tuesday night and refused to leave until the truth had won. I rather hoped you might, he said. She kissed him on the bridge over the Spree with the city around them, and it was exactly the same as the first time. Warm, certain, unhurried, and also entirely different, because now it was not the beginning of something but the middle of it, and the middle was so much better than she had expected the middle to feel. They went back to Vienna a week later, both of them, because Vienna was where the story had started, and it was where, for now, Alaric needed to be. And Sienna had found that her work went very well in a city with very good coffee and a small first district apartment with candles in every room, and someone in it who was very interested in whatever she was working on. The court's formal clearance of Alaric's record was entered into the blood register in December, a ceremony that Vesperin Kroll conducted with less grinding stone formality than usual, and what might have been, from a very specific angle, a form of relief. Cassivian Muir attended and shook Sienna's hand afterward, with a warmth that she recognized as the vampire equivalent of an extremely effusive display of approval. Isaveth played at a concert the following week, and put 2 tickets in an envelope addressed to Sienna's name, and the concert was extraordinary. And Alaric sat beside her in the 4th row and watched Sienna's face while she listened to his cousin play and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing she had ever seen him do. They registered the relationship formally with the court on a January morning, in a brief and legally dense proceeding that Sienna had prepared for by reading every blood law provision she could access, which meant she understood it better than several of the court officials present, which she was careful not to demonstrate too openly out of respect for Alaric's ongoing political relationships. Afterward, outside the Kaiserstein building, standing in the cold January air, he looked at her with everything he was, ancient and regal and protective and deeply, genuinely happy, and said, "The court's records now formally describe you as being under Radu bloodline protection, which means that anything any member of the vampire community does to threaten you is a direct action against the Radu line. You are, in every legal sense available to this world, mine to protect." "That is a very Gothic way of saying you are committed to the relationship," she said. "I am 417 years old," he said. "My declarations are inevitably Gothic. I apologize for nothing." She laughed. Standing on the Vienna pavement in January with the cold, making her breath visible, and the man she loved watching her laugh with that quiet, complete happiness, that was the most valuable thing she had seen in her life. "I do not want you to apologize for anything," she said. "I want you exactly as you are." He reached for her hand. She gave it. They walked. The truth had won exactly as she had known it would. Exactly as it always did when someone was willing to follow it all the way down, past the underground chambers and the ancient politics and the blood laws and the fear, to the place where it waited, patient and permanent, for someone to arrive and say, "I see you, I know what you are, and I am not going anywhere until everyone else knows it too." And in following the truth to its end, she had found something she had not known she was looking for, a man who was ancient and protective and regal and honorable, who had stood in chains and not broken, who had trusted her when he had no reason to trust anything, who looked at her like she was singular in 400 years of living, who held her hand in January on a Vienna street and walked beside her with the easy certainty of someone who has finally, after a very long time, found exactly where he wants to be. She had started the investigation trying to expose a criminal. She had ended it having exposed a lie, restored a truth, and discovered that love was possible in the strangest and most impossible places. Not despite the danger and the ancient codes and the world between worlds complexity of it, but through all of it, built from it. Stronger for everything it had survived to get to where it stood. The vampire heir of the Radu bloodline had been declared a traitor. The human detective had proved them all wrong, and in the proving, they had found each other in the only way that matters. Completely, honestly, and with everything they had. She squeezed his hand as they walked. He squeezed back. The city moved around them. Ancient and indifferent, and entirely unaware of everything that had been won beneath it, and above it the winter sky was wide and clear, and full of stars that had been there long before either of them, and would be there long after. And for right now, in this moment, that was exactly enough.